Hi, welcome to the second episode of U.S. History, but Interesting, the series where we go through American history connecting with the past by Alan Brinkley chapter by chapter, and talk about what the textbook says, what it doesn't say, and why you should care about this history right now in the 21st century. Today, we're covering Chapter 2, Transplantations and Borderlands, which covers the establishment of the 13 English colonies that would eventually become the United States, and their political history from about 1607 to the early 1700s. Let's get into it. Part 1, What Your Textbook Says. So last time, we talked about the Spanish Empire in the Americas, which was at least theoretically directly ruled by the Spanish crown. However, we also saw that there were limits to how much the government in Spain could really control its colonies, and we talked about how sometimes the implementation of policy in the Americas was more of a conversation between Europeans in the Americas and the government back home in Spain, rather than a strict chain of command. We're going to see a similar pattern today as we focus on the English colonies that would eventually become the United States. Now, the first thing to note is that not all English colonies were directly ruled by the king. Your textbook explains the different systems as they come up, but I think it's worth talking about them together at the outset so you can sort of compare and contrast. The AMSCO book defines three broad categories. First up, we have corporate colonies. These were run by joint stock companies, which work similarly to modern corporations. People in England would pool a bunch of money together to finance a colony, and then they agreed that if the colony was successful, they would share all the profits amongst themselves. Second, we have proprietary colonies. These were run by proprietors who were either individuals or groups that the king chose to privately own and operate a colony, generally again for the profit of the proprietors, but sometimes also for more philosophical reasons that were unique to a specific proprietor. The last type was royal colonies. In this version, the crown had direct authority over the colony, and the king had the right to appoint a royal governor to run things and swap that person out whenever he wanted. As we'll see, most of the English colonies on the American mainland would start out as either corporate or proprietary colonies, and eventually become royal colonies over time as the crown took a more active role in governing its possessions on the continent. First up, let's talk about Virginia. In 1607, the Virginia Company of London established the first permanent English settlement in the modern United States at Jamestown, Virginia. Now, the Virginia Company wasn't originally concerned with establishing a new society in America. What they really wanted was to grab all the gold like the Spanish had and bring it back to Europe to make all of their shareholders preposterously wealthy. Unfortunately, it turns out that there really wasn't a lot of gold in Virginia, and you can't actually eat mining equipment, so the early colonists wound up spending most of their time trying and failing to not starve to death. Of the first 144 English settlers, over 100 died in the first few months after arriving in America. Things didn't really get better from there, as you can probably tell from the fact that the winter of 1609 to 1610 is known as the Starving Time. Now, luckily for the English, there was a group of 30 Algonquian-speaking Native American tribes in eastern Virginia that had recently formed into what the English called the Powhatan Confederacy, after its chief, Wahun Seneca, whom they called Powhatan. Europeans really liked making up incorrect names for indigenous people. This is a trend that we'll see a lot in US history. Anyway, the Native Americans helped the English survive through the first few years at Jamestown by teaching them indigenous agricultural practices, which were more well suited to American crops and soil than European methods of farming were. Also, the Europeans straight up stole food from them. Now, the big breakthrough for the English came in 1612 when a man named John Rolfe figured out how to grow a local strain of tobacco that the natives were already cultivating. The Virginia Company jumped on this because they knew they could sell tobacco back in Europe, and this was their first chance to finally turn a profit. The problem was that growing tobacco requires a lot of land and a lot of labor. The company already had essentially all the land they could ever want because their charter from the king extended all the way to the Pacific, but they needed a way to get more people to the colony to actually grow the tobacco for them. So, they developed something called the head right system, which said that anyone who paid their own way to the colony would get 50 acres of land per person in their party, and wealthy colonists would receive another 50 acres of land for each indentured servant they paid to bring over. We'll talk more about indentured servitude in the next lecture, but for now, just know that indentured servants basically agreed to serve their masters for a specified term of 4 to 7 years, after which they would be free. Now, one issue with this was that the vast majority of people who came over to the colony were men. Many of them worked just long enough to turn a profit for themselves, and then they left. In 1619, in an effort to keep people in the colony where they could generate money for the Virginia Company, the company brought about 100 English women to the colony to marry male settlers, who would then pay the company a fee of 120 pounds of tobacco for their new bride. Now, if selling women for tobacco sounds absolutely insane to you, you're not alone. That's actually going to be the topic of the What the Textbook Doesn't Tell You section, because the book just literally says that it happens and then moves on like it's a normal thing. For now, though, there are two other things that happened in 1619 that I want to cover because I think they really help to highlight how varied the experience of life in America was for different groups in the colony. First, Virginia established the House of Burgesses, which was the first elected legislature in the English colonies that would eventually become the United States. Initially, all males aged 17 or older could vote for these representatives. That same year, a group of about 20 Africans were brought to Virginia and sold to the colonists. The institution of chattel slavery would take some time to develop in America, but this event still marks the beginning of the history of African enslavement in the English colonies on the continent. We'll go into more detail about this system in the next video, but if you want to learn more now, I highly recommend a series called Crash Course Black American History, which I'll link to in the description. Now, do you remember a minute ago when I said that the Virginia Company had all the land it could possibly use? Well, that was technically true in terms of English property law, but in reality, much of the land the company wanted to use to expand tobacco production was already inhabited by Native American groups like the Powhatan Confederacy. English colonists fought constantly with the Powhatan as they expanded westward and took more and more land from them. The Virginia Company actually went bankrupt as a result of one such war in 1622. This led the English crown to assume direct control of the colony in 1624 and appoint William Berkeley as the royal governor. Berkeley fought another war against the Powhatan in 1644, which ended with an agreement that no whites would settle beyond a specified point. However, not everyone in Virginian society was on board with this agreement. You see, one of the consequences of the headright system was that most of the land along the coast was dominated by large plantations belonging to rich families that had paid to bring a bunch of indentured servants over from Europe in the early years, and therefore received a bunch of 50-acre plots around Jamestown. As those indentures started to run out, the former servants had to go farther and farther west to find land that wasn't already controlled by these rich planter families. This led to a large population of poor former indentured servants living in the so-called backcountry, separated from the economic and political center of the colony along the coast. Many of them didn't own land, which meant not only that they couldn't start their own farm, but also that they weren't allowed to vote at this time. They didn't even really have the opportunity to find spouses, since the vast majority of colonists were still men at this time. Some of these former indentures became beggars, some became thieves, and some illegally crossed Berkeley's boundary to take land from Native Americans. Obviously, those Native Americans weren't going to just let the colonists take their land, so in 1675, war broke out again between the colonists and the Dogue and Susquehannock peoples. An Englishman named Nathaniel Bacon led an army against the Native Americans, defying Governor Berkeley, who declared Bacon and his men to be rebels. Bacon then led his army back to Jamestown and drove Berkeley into exile, before Bacon eventually died of dysentery and the rebellion was put down. Now, Bacon's rebellion was the biggest rebellion that the English colonies would see up until the American Revolution, and it has several important consequences. First of all, the colonial government realized that a rebellion from the backcountry was actually a bigger threat to them than the Native Americans were, so they agreed to be more aggressive about just taking land from Native Americans and giving it to white settlers. Now, that solved the immediate cause of Bacon's rebellion, but the rich Virginia planters started to think about what the real root cause of the rebellion was. You see, fundamentally, the problem was that laborers were upset because there were no opportunities available to them once they stopped working for the planters. Now, if you look at that sentence and you think, oh, the issue is the lack of opportunity. The colony just needs to provide opportunities for former indentures to earn money and social status so that they'll be happy and then they won't rebel. Well, then you're an absolute chump. You see, the Virginia planter class figured out that the real issue was that sometimes their laborers stopped working for them. All they had to do was find a source of labor that would never stop working for them, and then the lack of opportunity wouldn't even matter. Luckily for them, African slavery provided a perfect solution to this problem. And, as the cherry on top, it turns out that Nathaniel Bacon's army had included both black and white indentured servants, and actually, there was a history in Virginia of black and white servants working together to try to escape servitude. Instituting a system of race-based slavery and enforcing a separation between poor blacks and poor whites in Virginian society would prevent those two groups from ever uniting to challenge the planter class in the future. We'll talk more about the effects of this shift away from indentured servitude and towards chattel slavery in the next chapter. The colony of Maryland was established in 1634 as a proprietary colony run by the Catholic Lord Baltimore. Baltimore basically had two goals for this colony. First, establish a haven for Catholics who were worried about religious persecution back in England, and second, make money through something called real estate speculation, which is a fancy word for gambling. Anyway, Maryland was similar to Virginia in a lot of ways. They farmed tobacco, they had a headright system, and they relied on the labor of indentured servants and eventually enslaved Africans. Baltimore's vision of a Catholic colony, however, was hampered by the fact that way more Protestants wanted to come than Catholics. This led to tensions between the two groups, especially during periods of open violence between Catholics and Protestants back in England. To make sure everyone in Maryland got along, and to prove he wasn't favoring his fellow Catholics, Baltimore created a Toleration Act to guarantee that all Christians could worship however they wanted. However, during the mid-1650s, local Protestants actually forced Baltimore's governor to resign, kicked all of the Catholics out of the colonial assembly, and repealed the Toleration Act. Baltimore's government would eventually be restored along with the Toleration Act, but this is still an important lesson because it reminds us that historically, the path towards religious toleration isn't always a straight line. Sometimes we make progress, and sometimes we reverse that progress. Let's move on to New England. Last time, we talked about some radical Protestants who were called separatists because they wanted to be completely separate from the Church of England. Well, in the early 1600s, some of those separatists decided to leave England and set up a community in Holland, but they came to the conclusion that Holland wasn't quite separate enough, so they separated themselves all the way across the ocean to Cape Cod in modern Massachusetts. These settlers called themselves the Pilgrims, and before they came ashore in 1620, they wrote and signed a document called the Mayflower Compact, which established the rules for civil government in their community. This is important because it was the first written constitution for self-governance in the English colonies that would eventually become the United States. Now, back in England, King Charles I was implementing policies that targeted another group of Protestants who were called Puritans. These Puritans began looking for ways to escape this religious persecution, and they eventually settled on the Massachusetts Bay Company, which was another joint stock company like the Virginia Company. However, by 1630, this company had become more than just a get-rich-quick scheme. It actually had the mission of establishing a Puritan community in America. Under the leadership of a man named John Winthrop, they sailed across the ocean and did exactly that, founding cities like Boston and Newton, which would eventually become Cambridge. Now, it's often said that the Puritans came to America seeking religious freedom, which is sort of true. But freedom is often a very vague term, so whenever we talk about freedom, we need to remember to ask freedom for whom, and freedom to do what. In this case, it was freedom for them to practice their religion. It was decidedly not freedom for anyone else to practice any other religion. Because of this, several groups that developed different religious views from the Puritan mainstream either left or were banished from Massachusetts and wound up starting their own colonies in Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. There are two of these religious dissenters who are really worth talking about. The first is Roger Williams, who is most noteworthy for supporting complete separation of church and state. Unfortunately for him, Massachusetts was a theocracy at this point, so that idea was actually super heresy, and he got super banished. He wound up establishing Rhode Island, which actually implemented his idea of separation of church and state, and allowed people, even including Jews, to worship however they wanted. The second important religious dissenter was Anne Hutchinson. She argued that the Puritan leaders of Massachusetts were unfit for positions of leadership, and perhaps more controversially, she argued that women should be allowed to take active roles in the church. This went against Puritan teachings that women should be quiet and deferential to the men in their community. Hutchinson actually gained a large following of both men and women, but eventually the mainstream Puritans were able to banish her to Rhode Island as well. Afterward, the male clergy restricted the public activities of women in the colony even further, prompting many of Hutchinson's followers to leave Massachusetts for New Hampshire, which would become its own colony several decades later. Now, because New England wasn't as densely populated by indigenous peoples as Virginia was, in the early years the English colonists in New England didn't face as much conflict with Native Americans as the colonists in Virginia had. However, as the colonies expanded, the English took more and more land from the Native Americans, and the two groups also came into conflict over who should control the valuable fur trade in the region. These tensions exploded into the Pequot War in 1636, in which the English massacred the Pequot people and sold many of the survivors into slavery. They also led to another war in 1675, which is called King Philip's War, after the English name for the Wampanoag Sachem Metacomet. It would be the bloodiest war per capita in American history. I'm not going to be able to go into great detail here, but if you're interested, I'll link to a video from a channel called Autun Shea, which I think does a great job of covering some of the intricacies of the war. Suffice it to say, the series of wars that culminated in King Philip's War allowed the English to solidify their control over New England. Moving on. A minute ago, I talked about how the English King Charles I discriminated against Puritans in his kingdom. Well, it turns out that he also did some other tyrannical stuff, like not allowing Parliament to meet for over a decade, and this touched off the English Civil War, which you really don't need to worry about for US history, but the important thing is that in 1660, in an event that's called the Stuart Restoration, Charles II became the new king, and he had some supporters who had helped him become king, whom he now needed to reward. He did this by setting up new colonies with his friends as proprietors. These were the so-called Restoration colonies. First up was the colony of Carolina, which was named for the Latin spelling of Charles. This colony was largely divided from the start, with the north being poorer and more isolated, and the south being richer, more commercial, and more aristocratic, because there was a good port there called Charlestown, or later Charleston. Guess who that's named after? Meanwhile, in 1664, Charles II granted a charter to his brother, the Duke of York, for all the land between Connecticut and the Delaware River. The Duke of York pointed out to him that the Dutch actually already had a colony there, to which Charles said, "Oh, yeah, right, I meant to do something about that." And then he sent a fleet to seize the city of New Amsterdam from the Dutch. The Duke of York changed the name of the colony and its principal port to New York, because honestly, he felt sort of left out when everyone was naming things after his brother, and he felt like at least a few things should be named after him, too. The Duke of York granted land to his political allies, but he allowed the Dutch settlers to keep their land too, and they formed a power block of their own, which helped make New York's politics contentious and factional from the start. Good thing that's definitely not true anymore, right? The Duke of York also granted some land in the south to his friends who couldn't really figure out how to make money out of it, so eventually they gave it to the crown, making it the royal colony of New Jersey. Now, there's one other religious sect that we need to talk about, which was the Quakers. You see, Quakers are Protestants, but they're also pacifists, and they believe in the equality of men and women in the church. The Quakers become important to our story when they convert a young Englishman named William Penn. When Penn's father died in 1681, William inherited a large debt that the king owed his father. Charles II, who had even less cash on hand than he had original ideas for naming things, paid Penn in land in America, making him the proprietor of a colony named Pennsylvania after his father. Now, while William Penn was proprietor, he actually earned a reputation for dealing with Native Americans, and in particular the local Lenape or Delaware people, with respect and fairness. In 1682, Penn and the Lenape signed the Treaty of Shakamaxon to ensure peace. However, after Penn's death, his children didn't maintain the same sense of fairness. Most famously, in 1737, they engineered something called the walking purchase, which the Encyclopedia Britannica refers to as a, quote, land swindle. Essentially, they agreed to buy land defined by how far a man could walk in a day and a half, and then they hired the three fastest runners in the colony to run as far as possible during that time. They took about twice as much land as the Lenape expected, and they destroyed any sense of goodwill that their father had built during his lifetime. For now, though, let's go back to William Penn for a second and talk about the types of people that he brought to America to populate his new colony. Penn attracted colonists from all over Europe, making Pennsylvania the most cosmopolitan of the early colonies. Unfortunately, Penn couldn't figure out how to really make money from owning the colony, and he eventually ceded much of his control to the people who actually lived there. This allowed the three counties to the south to break off and become the colony of Delaware. So, now that we've talked about all of the colonies except Georgia, which I promise I'll come back to in a minute, I want to take a step back and look at the British Empire as a whole, and I want to make three specific points about it. First, the colonies on the American mainland were not the main focus for most of this period. Second, the British Empire was only one of many players in the broader Atlantic world at this point, and much of early American history was driven by the interactions between those players. Third, mercantilism was still the driving economic force in the empire. So, to the first point, the British Empire wasn't mainly focused on the mainland during this period. Why? Well, because the mainland colonies just weren't making as much money as British colonies in the Caribbean like Barbados, Jamaica, and Antigua were. These Caribbean colonies generated tremendous amounts of wealth for the British by growing sugar, which is insanely profitable if you farm it with slave labor, which the British did. In fact, during this period in the Caribbean, enslaved Africans came to outnumber the wealthy white planters who were profiting off of their labor. Because the planters were afraid of their slaves rebelling and killing them, they instituted a series of progressively harsher slave codes, which were laws that allowed plantation owners to treat their enslaved workers however they want, up to even killing them without any consequences. Over time, the mainland colonies would implement their own versions of these slave codes, which we'll talk more about next time. That brings us to the second facet of the British Empire at this point, which was that it wasn't alone in the Western Hemisphere. Remember that at this time the Spanish, French, and Dutch empires were all still major players in North America. In fact, conflict between Spain and Britain actually drove the settlement of two eventual US states. In Florida, the Spanish established forts along the northern border to protect against Britain, and on the opposite side, the British set up a colony in Georgia in the 1730s to provide defense against further Spanish invasion. The original leader of that colony also wanted it to serve as an alternative to prison for Englishmen who couldn't pay their debts, but like with many colonies, the proprietor wasn't really able to run it successfully, and eventually it became a royal colony in 1751. Now, I mentioned the other Europeans in North America, But we shouldn't forget that most of North America was still actually controlled by indigenous nations at this point. Your textbook paints a nice picture of what it calls middle grounds, which were essentially unique social environments on the periphery of colonial society where diverse European and indigenous cultures met and mixed, often building relationships around commerce and shared understanding rather than violence. Now, we shouldn't forget that Native Americans existed outside the context of war with Europeans, and we shouldn't forget that at various times and places in American history, interactions between natives and Europeans were dominated more by commerce than by war. However, it's important that we place these middle grounds in their proper historical context. As we study these middle grounds throughout American history, we need to realize that the places where Native Americans and Europeans interacted peacefully regularly moved farther and farther west following brutal wars between mostly white settlers and Native Americans who were generally just defending their homeland. To give a sense of how pervasive this was, here's Wikipedia's list of wars between Western nations and Native Americans. For reference, the last time the United States Army was in armed conflict with Native Americans was actually in 1918 in the Battle of Bear Valley. So, no, violence and conquest is not all of Native American history, but it is the larger context in which Native American history happened after the English began showing up in large numbers in the 17th century. And it's important for us to remember that, even as we talk about the peaceful commercial parts. Now, the third point about the British Empire was that their understanding of the economy was driven by mercantilism, which you'll recall essentially said that your country should try to win trade by exporting more expensive things than you import, so that the other countries wind up giving you money. Now, the thing about that is, winning trade transactions with your colonies is actually really easy because your government controls both sides of the exchange. The only tricky part is making sure that your colonies don't trade with anyone else, because that could result in money sort of leaking out of your empire and into somebody else's. To that end, in the 1660s, the English crown passed a pair of navigation acts, which required all trade with America to happen using British ships. However, since American colonists were already trading with other European empires at this point, they basically just chose to ignore those laws. Remember how last time I said that the letter of the law and the implementation of that law aren't always the same? Well, by 1673, the king had noticed this discrepancy too, and he passed another navigation act that sent more British customs officials to America to actually enforce his policy. This increased the demand for British ships, and since ships built in the British colonies counted, this law sort of accidentally encouraged the development of a shipbuilding industry in New England. For the rest of the colonies, however, mercantilist policies generally kept them producing either raw materials or cash crops and buying their finished goods from England to make sure to maintain that favorable trade balance for the mother country. Now, despite orders from London, Massachusetts was still refusing to enforce some of the navigation acts, and in response, Charles II revoked the colony's charter and made it a royal colony. Then, his successor, James II, eliminated the local assemblies that governed the northern colonies entirely. He gathered them together into the Dominion of New England and put a man named Edmund Andros in charge. Now, there were two problems with this setup. First, Edmund Andros was very bad at his job. And second, James II was also bad at his job, so back home the British replaced him with a new set of monarchs, William and Mary. When news of this reached the colonies, the people of Boston deposed Andros, and the people of New York deposed his lieutenant governor. Not wanting to be left out of the fun, the Protestant majority in Maryland deposed their Catholic proprietary government and took this opportunity to outlaw Catholicism again. In the end, the Dominion of New England was dissolved and the colonial assemblies were reinstated, so score one for American self-governance. But at the same time, by deposing their proprietary government, Maryland had chose to come under the direct rule of the English crown. And because most of the colonies were royal colonies now, the British government was actually able to govern America more directly through royal governors and the growing British bureaucracy on the continent. These competing trends of increasing self-governance and increasing royal control would continue over the next century and eventually lead to the American Revolution. That brings us to part 2, what your textbook doesn't say. So earlier I mentioned the so-called tobacco brides. These were women that the Virginia Company sent to the colony as wives for the male colonists. Let's talk about some of the specifics of this arrangement. First off, these women came to the colony voluntarily. This is notable because, as we'll see in the next chapter, many people who came to the colonies in this period did so against their will, whether they were enslaved or just forced into indentured servitude. So if that's the case, why did these tobacco brides choose to come to Virginia? Well, the company paid for their passage to the colony, and it gave them a dowry in the form of clothes, home furnishings, and even a plot of land. Additionally, you'll recall that the Virginia Company charged male colonists 120, later 150 pounds of tobacco to marry one of these women. That ensured that if a woman did choose to come to the colony, she would be able to marry someone who was already financially stable. And on top of that, the tobacco brides were actually given free rein to choose which men they wanted to marry after they got there. So, for many English women from working class backgrounds, that was actually a pretty sweet deal compared to what they could expect if they stayed in England. But, lest you think this was some high minded feminist move on the part of the Virginia Company, you should know that only about 2/3 of the tobacco payment the company charged actually went to providing for the women. The rest went directly to the company's bottom line. Ultimately, this was a profit move. But in the end, regardless of why the company did it, this policy did provide actual economic opportunities for women. However, it only directly affected about 150 women total, and women is a very large, very vague category. So it's worth being a little more specific about who actually benefited from this. You see, the Virginia Company was looking for a specific type of English women to bring to Virginia. Obviously, they needed women who weren't already married, and beyond that, they used the phrase young, handsome, and honestly educated. So we know that older women, women who weren't deemed attractive enough, and uneducated women also weren't able to take advantage of this program. On top of that, when you applied, the Virginia Company actually required you to bring someone like a family member or a clergyman with you to vouch for your character and your skills. This requirement excluded some women who didn't have those sorts of social connections, homeless women, for example, or women in prison. Last of all, we should note that this opportunity was only available to English women. African women and indigenous women couldn't participate either. So, really, when we say that this policy provided economic opportunities for women, what we mean is that this policy provided economic opportunities for some young, pretty, unmarried, working class English women. This is an important distinction because it reminds us that when we talk historically about women as a single category, we're covering up a lot of diversity within that category, and it's worth digging a little deeper to really understand specifically who we're talking about. Part 3. What does this have to do with modern life? In this chapter, we talked about a lot of things that you could identify as foundations for parts of modern America. I mean, you could easily point to the Virginia House of Burgesses, or the Mayflower Compact, or the Toleration Act, and say, there you go, representative government, constitutionalism, religious freedom, America. But I think you guys already get those ones, so instead I want to talk about something a little bit more subtle. If you've ever heard someone criticize America, whether they're talking about the culture, or the government, or the economy, you've probably heard someone respond by saying, well, if you don't like America, you can get out. You hear the same thing when immigrants criticize something and people tell them, well, if you don't like it, you can go back to wherever you came from. I'd like to put forth the idea that those sentiments are directly analogous to the ones we talked about earlier that led the colony of Massachusetts to banish Roger Williams for proposing separation of church and state, and Anne Hutchinson for suggesting that women should be allowed to have opinions. You see, the Puritans in colonial Massachusetts believed that they had the one perfect, correct answer to how God wanted society to be organized. And as a result, any criticism or any attempt at reform was a direct existential threat to their society. Any change could literally destroy the entire thing. But the modern United States can't really make that same argument for a couple of reasons. First off, there isn't one uniform American society right now. People clearly don't live the same way in Manhattan as they do in the suburbs of Miami or in Las Vegas or in rural North Dakota. American society is actually a bunch of different things already. Secondly, you can't argue that any minute change to America will destroy it, because we're literally in the middle of a history class discussing all of the ways America has changed over the course of centuries. And spoiler warning, this course doesn't end with, and then America was destroyed. So with that in mind, we don't have to make the same mistakes that 17th century Puritans did. We don't have to view every single criticism as if it's a threat. That allows us to actually engage with well thought out critiques of our society, rather than just trying to banish everyone who doesn't agree with us. Now, in doing that, we're probably going to hear some absolute garbage hot takes, but we're probably also going to hear some good ideas. And if we can identify those ideas and implement them, we actually have the opportunity to change our society for the better. And that is clearly an opportunity worth taking. So yeah, that's it for episode 2. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Otherwise, we'll be back for Chapter 3, Society and Culture in Provincial America, in which the term witch hunt is actually being used literally for once. So, yay?